Hello. We're talking about nutrition today. Tell your friends where you get your protein from. That's right. Treats. What? Who said the T word? Bad idea. I gotta go take care of that now. Why, hello there, endurance nerds, gym rats, weekend warriors, and those of you who are just here because you like arguing with people about nutrition on the internet. Hit the like button if you like fighting with strangers on social media. It's okay. You can admit it. It can be cathartic at times. But today we are cutting through the absolute bullshit that clogs up the online space of sports nutrition. We're not here for influencer hype, trust me bro anecdotes, or whatever diet trend is popular this week. We're here for real evidence-based science on how to properly fuel your training, optimize performance, and recover like a pro. If you've ever bonked so hard that you started wondering if you needed rehab mid-race, felt like you needed an advanced chemistry degree to understand sports drinks, or wondered if you really needed to spend half your paycheck on protein powders, congratulations, you're asking all the right questions. By the end of this video, you'll know exactly how to fuel for endurance sports, avoid catastrophic energy crashes, and separate actual performance-enhancing nutrition from overhyped marketing garbage. I'll also close out the video by answering some of your questions. What's burning in the mind of the endurance nerds? So with that rousing preamble out of the way, let's get right into it. Your body is not magic. It is a biochemical engine, and like any engine, it needs the right fuel to function at its best. You wouldn't put diesel fuel in a Ferrari, right? Unless you simply hate Ferraris. But in that vein, you wouldn't put nonsense into your body to fuel its own engine. Only the majority of people do, and I firmly believe the reason for this comes down to education. The lines have been blurred between fact and marketing for years, and I'm going to use this video to bring everybody back to the basics. Your body's fuel comes from 3 primary macronutrients: carbohydrates, fats, and proteins. Each one has a specific job, and how your body uses them depends on the exercise intensity and duration. If you're not attentive to the balance, you'll either feel like a rocket ship or a rusty lawnmower. So let's start with the most misunderstood of the 3, carbohydrates. If you're doing endurance sports, carbs are your best friend. Not just the friend that you occasionally text, but your ride or die, help you move a body at 2 a.m. kind of friend. But for some reason, they've been demonized by diet culture like they pulled somebody's pants down in public. Let's get one thing straight. If you are training for endurance sports, you need carbs. No, not because Big Pasta is sponsoring this video, but because it's basic human physiology. If you've been told carbs are bad, congratulations, you've been lied to. It's time to disabuse yourself of that notion. When you eat carbohydrates, your body breaks them down into glucose, which is then either immediately used for energy or stored as glycogen in your muscles and in the liver. These glycogen stores are limited, and once they're gone, your performance tanks. This is why athletes who try to train or race hard on a low-carb diet often feel like they've been hit by a truck. Your body is trying to burn fat instead of glycogen, which sounds great in theory until you realize that fat oxidation is slow as hell and can't keep up with high-intensity demands. At rest or during low-intensity exercise, your body burns a higher percentage of fat for energy because it has the time to break it down. But as exercise intensity increases, fat cannot be converted to ATP fast enough, so your body shifts to carbohydrates as the primary fuel source. This is why high-intensity exercise is almost entirely carbohydrate-driven. Now, before we talk about what happens when glycogen runs out, let's break down how your body actually transitions from using glucose in the bloodstream to relying on stored glycogen. When you start exercising, your body doesn't immediately dive into glycogen stores. Instead, it begins by using circulating glucose, the glucose that's already in your bloodstream from recent meals or snacks. This is the easiest energy to access, and as long as blood glucose levels are stable, your body will continue to pull from it. However, as exercise continues and glucose levels start to drop, your muscles begin breaking down the glycogen to maintain energy output. This process, known as glycogenolysis, converts stored glycogen into glucose 1-phosphate, which is then rapidly converted into glucose 6-phosphate, which is a key player in the production of ATP, which is your body's primary energy currency. The rate at which this happens depends on exercise intensity. If you're doing a low-intensity session, fat oxidation is still playing a role, and glycogen breakdown remains relatively slow. But as intensity ramps up, your muscles increase glycogenolysis, funneling more glucose into glycolysis to generate ATP at a faster rate. Here's the important point. Your body can only store about 300 to 600 grams of glycogen in your muscles, which is enough for about 90 minutes to 2 hours of moderate to high intensity exercise. Your liver holds another 80 to 100 grams, which is really there to help regulate blood sugar. But once these reserves are depleted, that's when you bonk. And I don't mean metaphorically, I mean your muscles physically run out of fuel and your body forces you to slow down because fat oxidation alone simply can't sustain the effort. This is why endurance athletes need to fuel properly before exercise, consume carbs during prolonged activity to keep circulating glucose stable, and replenish glycogen post-workout. Ignoring this reality in favor of some low-carb fad diet is a guaranteed way to underperform. If you've been around this channel for a while, you'll know that I hammer the importance of carbs over and over and over again. I'm hoping that showcasing these concepts again here will only reinforce the importance of carbohydrates in endurance sports. But let's talk protein now, the macronutrient that fitness influencers influencers love to hype up like it's a magic bullet for performance. But despite what some people will think, eating more protein won't instantly turn you into a super athlete. Protein is not fuel. I repeat, protein is not fuel. It's a building material. Protein's function is to play a critical role in muscle repair and recovery and adaptation to training. Here's how it works. Every time you train, especially with strength or endurance exercise, you create micro tears in your muscle fibers. This is normal and necessary for adaptation. Your body repairs these fibers using amino acids, which are the building blocks of protein, to rebuild them stronger and more resistant to fatigue. So to be abundantly clear, protein is very important. It's just not an efficient energy or fuel source. Unlike carbohydrates and fats, your body doesn't like burning protein for fuel. If it does, it means that you're either underfueled on carbs or fats, or you're breaking down muscle tissue to keep the body going. Neither of those situations is ideal. This is why protein intake should be focused on recovery and not fueling workouts. But how much protein do you actually need? Endurance athletes do well between 1.2 and 2 grams per kilogram of body weight per day. The higher your volume or load, the more you want to push to the higher side of that range to support recovery and muscle protein synthesis to drive those adaptations. Strength athletes, on the other hand, so powerlifters, sprinters, or athletes in team sports like American football, they're a bit higher at 1.6 to 2.4 grams per kilogram of body weight per day. More than that won't magically build extra muscle. In most cases, the excess will be excreted, or in those extreme cases, can be converted into energy. But again, we don't want to be inefficient or catabolic to fuel a workout. Not to mention the GI discomfort and the discomfort caused to everybody else in the room who has to smell your protein farts. It's pretty off-putting. So that influencer telling that you need 500 grams of protein per day, well, if you believe that, I have a bridge to sell you. Timing also matters. Protein synthesis is elevated for 24 to 48 hours post-exercise, so spreading your intake throughout the day is more effective than loading up all at once. There's a long-running debate as to how much protein your body can actually use in a single meal. Some people claim that your body can only absorb about 20 to 25 grams of protein per meal, while others argue more is better. The reality is it depends on muscle protein synthesis versus whole body protein metabolism. Studies suggest that for maximizing muscle protein synthesis, which would be applicable to us as athletes, the ideal per meal protein intake falls around 0.3 to 0.4 grams per kilogram of body weight, which is about 20 to 40 grams per meal for most people. Beyond this, protein is still absorbed and used for other bodily functions, but it doesn't further enhance muscle repair and growth. This is why slamming 80 grams of protein in one meal doesn't magically double your recovery. It just gets broken down for other uses or stored as excess calories. To maximize muscle repair, combine protein with carbohydrates post-workout. The carbs replenish your glycogen, and the protein delivers amino acids for recovery. Research suggests that the ideal ratio is around 3 to 1 to 4 to 1 carbs to protein, ensuring that glycogen restoration and muscle protein synthesis will happen simultaneously. But we'll talk a lot more about nutrient timing here shortly. But we're going to shift gears once more and talk fat, the misunderstood macronutrient that endurance athletes either obsess over or completely ignore. Fat is a fantastic energy source for long, steady state activities like ultra running. It provides more energy per gram than carbs, so 9 calories per gram versus the 4 for carbs and protein, making it an efficient long-term fuel for extended efforts. But there's a problem. Fat is slow to metabolize. Your body burns fat efficiently at low intensities, but as soon as that intensity ramps up, fat can't provide ATP fast enough. This is why during high-intensity efforts like a sprint, surge, hard climb, your body shifts to using carbs, because carbs are the only fuel source that can keep up with the ATP demand. Some endurance athletes try to become fat-adapted through low-carb, high-fat diets, and the idea is to train the body to burn fat and spare glycogen. And while this does work to some extent, it comes at a cost. It limits your ability to perform at high intensities. Studies show that fat-adapted athletes burn more fat at lower intensities, but their ability to utilize carbohydrates effectively is compromised. This means slower race paces, weaker surges, and poor finishing kicks, which in competition is the difference between winning and getting dropped. But on the flip side, there is another group of athletes who avoid fat entirely, not for performance reasons, but in pursuit of extreme leanness. Some mistakenly assume that body fat stores alone are enough to sustain them, leading them to severely restrict dietary fat in their diets. While it is true that the body has plenty of stored fat, dietary fat plays an essential role beyond fuel, including hormone production, cell membrane integrity, and recovery. A low-fat diet can negatively impact your endurance performance just as much as a low-carb diet. Fat is crucial for absorbing fat-soluble vitamins like A, D, E, and K, supporting joint health and maintaining hormonal balance. And that's going to be critical for recovery, adaptation, and overall athletic longevity. So how much fat should you actually be getting? Research suggests that endurance athletes should consume around 0.8 to 1.5 grams of fat per kilogram of body weight per day, with the lower end being sufficient for those high-carb fueling strategies and the higher end benefiting those ultra-endurance athletes or those training at lower intensities. So for a 70-kilogram athlete, that translates to about 56 to 105 grams of fat per day, enough to support the essential functions while still prioritizing carbohydrate intake for performance. Going below 0.5 grams per kilogram consistently can lead to energy deficiencies, hormonal disruptions, and impaired recovery. The bottom line is that over-focusing on either low-carb or low-fat extremes can lead to suboptimal performance, slow recovery, and increased injury risk. Instead, fuel smart, train hard, and give your body what it needs to perform at its peak. But now that we've covered what to eat, let's talk about when to eat, because timing your nutrition properly is the difference between feeling strong throughout your session and completely crashing halfway through. Proper nutrient timing maximizes performance, improves recovery, and prevents energy crashes and bonking. Fueling isn't just about getting enough calories, it's about delivering the right nutrients at the right time to support endurance, power output, and post-exercise adaptations. Despite the somewhat lazy approach taken by many busy athletes, proper endurance nutrition does not and cannot begin with the first stride or pedal stroke within your session. Fueling before your workouts is of paramount importance, and a step that all too many people get wrong. Fueling before exercise is all about starting your session with optimal glycogen stores and stable blood sugar levels. If you don't properly fuel before a workout, your body has to rely more on stored glycogen and fat oxidation, which can lead to premature fatigue, especially if your glycogen stores are already low. For best performance, aim to eat 2 to 3 hours before exercise, prioritizing a carbohydrate-based meal with some protein and a little bit of fat. This gives your body enough time to digest, absorb nutrients, and store glycogen for the effort ahead. Good options include things like oatmeal with fruit and a protein source, maybe rice with some tofu, lean meat, or some eggs, or whole grain toast with some peanut butter and a banana. But I can hear many of you right now. What if you don't have 2 to 3 hours before training? Maybe you train in the morning and the thought of waking up at 4 a.m. just to eat a meal isn't exactly appealing. In this case, if you're within 30 to 60 minutes of exercise, focus on easily digestible carbohydrates that won't sit heavy in your stomach or cause GI distress. Good choices include things like bananas, a small energy bar, or a slice of toast with some honey. Avoid foods that are high in fat, fiber, or too much protein right before exercise, as these are going to slow down your digestion and can lead to stomach discomfort mid-workout. But what about fasted training? Some athletes swear by morning fasted workouts, arguing that training on an empty stomach trains the body to burn more fat for fuel. And they're not wrong. Studies have shown that fasted sessions can increase fat oxidation over time and improve metabolic flexibility. However, there's a catch. Fat oxidation does not equal performance. Training fasted might make you better at burning fat, but it won't necessarily make you faster, stronger, or help you sustain high-intensity efforts. In fact, if you're doing high-intensity intervals, tempo runs, long training sessions, skipping pre-workout fuel can reduce power output, limit endurance capacity, and increase muscle breakdown. Fasted training is best reserved for those low-intensity, short-duration sessions like recovery runs or short Zone 2 cycling where performance demands are really low. For most athletes, fueling before workouts enhances training quality, meaning that you can push harder, sustain intensity longer, and ultimately get more out of each session. So while fasted training has its place, it's not a universal strategy. And if you feel like garbage doing it, that's your body's way of telling you that it wants fuel. I've said it before and I will repeat it here. Don't diet in your training sessions. But once you've actually started your session, your fueling needs depend more on duration and intensity. For short workouts, under 60 minutes, most people don't need extra fuel. Water is enough, as long as you've nailed your pre-session nutrition. If you do find yourself behind the 8 ball, so going into your session, having missed the opportunity to fuel beforehand, you can follow some of the standards that I'm going to talk about here to ensure that you have enough free circulating glucose to perform. For sessions lasting 1 to 2 hours, 30 to 60 grams of carbohydrates per hour is generally sufficient for moderate intensity training. At this level, your body is still burning a mix of fat and carbohydrates, and glycogen depletion isn't really happening at a rapid rate. However, once exercise intensity increases to a little below a threshold and above, your body is now relying almost entirely on glucose and glycogen, and carbohydrate needs increase. In these cases, the research strongly supports 60 to 90 grams of carbohydrates per hour to sustain performance, prevent bonking, and delay fatigue. For workouts lasting longer than 2 hours, 60 to 90 grams per hour is recommended across all the intensities, along with adding in electrolytes to replace that sodium lost through sweat. Longer sessions place greater demands on glycogen stores, and even if you're at lower intensity, maintaining consistent carbohydrate intake ensures endurance and prevents late session fatigue. Now, some well-trained athletes can push carbohydrate intake to 90 to 120 grams per hour, particularly in events like Ironman races, ultramarathons, or elite cycling events where energy expenditure is massive, and their individual ability to absorb those exogenous carbohydrates is pretty well trained. However, most recreational and even competitive endurance athletes should just start with that 60 to 90 gram range and adjust based on gut tolerance and training adaptations. The key point here is that you don't fuel adequately during long training sessions, your body will start breaking down muscle protein for energy, leading to slower recovery, increased muscle soreness, and potential losses in lean muscle mass over time. This is why strategic carbohydrate intake isn't just about energy, it's about protecting your muscle from unnecessary breakdown. Now let's talk post-exercise. After exercise, your priority is replenishing glycogen, repairing muscle tissue, and rehydrating. The idea of an anabolic window, a short time frame where your body is supposedly more primed for nutrient absorption, has definitely evolved in recent years. For strength athletes, research now suggests that total protein intake over the day is more important than that immediate post-workout consumption, as long as you're eating enough regularly. But for endurance athletes, nutrient timing post-exercise still plays a pretty significant role, particularly when it comes to glycogen replenishment. If you're training again within 24 hours, consuming carbohydrates in the first 30 to 60 minutes post-exercise is really beneficial because the glycogen resynthesis rates are at their highest during this period. In this phase, carbohydrates should be the primary focus, and refilling glycogen stores quickly helps to sustain performance in those subsequent training sessions. You can choose to add in maybe a modest amount of protein, again that 3 to 4 to 1 ratio to get a jump start on those recovery needs, and you're going to be in pretty good shape. There are a number of recovery shakes out there that you'll find that are designed around those ratios, but you can use a number of different fueling strategies to hit those macros post-workout. Within 1 to 2 hours after exercise, adding a solid meal with a bit more protein further supports that muscle repair, adaptation, and continued glycogen replenishment. While the urgency of immediate protein intake has been overstated for strength athletes, and the timing is a bit less critical there, delaying carbohydrate intake post-exercise can really slow down your glycogen replenishment, which is critical if you have another workout later in the day or the following day. So while the old concept of an anabolic window has been softened a bit, post-exercise fueling is still crucial for endurance athletes, especially those training frequently. When you eat strategically, your body recovers faster, handles higher training loads more efficiently, and performs better overall. But we've covered fueling. Let's talk hydration, because if you get this wrong, it doesn't matter how well you've eaten, your performance will fall off a cliff. Hydration is critical, but drinking too much water can be just as bad as drinking too little. Yes, you heard that right, more is not always better. Water makes up about 60% of your body weight, and it plays a huge role in regulating blood volume, core temperature, and nutrient transport. But when you sweat, you're not just losing water, you're also losing electrolytes, particularly sodium, which is vital for muscle contractions, nerve function, and maintaining fluid balance. If you lose just 2% of your body weight in sweat, your performance drops significantly. Studies show that endurance capacity, cognitive function, and perceived effort all take a huge hit. And if dehydration reaches 3 to 5% of body weight, core temperature rises, heart rate spikes, and fatigue sets in much earlier. This is why prehydration matters. Starting a workout or race already dehydrated is a recipe for disaster. If you feel thirsty before you even begin, you're already screwed. But overhydration is just as dangerous. While dehydration can slow you down, overhydration can actually be deadly. If you drink too much water without replacing sodium, you dilute the sodium concentration in your blood, and that leads to a condition called hyponatremia. Hyponatremia leads to nausea, confusion, headaches, muscle cramps, and in severe cases, seizures, coma, and even death. This happens more often than people think, particularly in long races like marathons and Ironman events, where athletes overcompensate by drinking excessive amounts of plain water without enough sodium. So how much water do you actually need? And the answer really depends on duration, intensity, temperature, and individual sweat rate. Workouts over 60 minutes, water is usually fine. You don't usually need added electrolytes unless it's extremely hot or humid. Sessions longer than 60 minutes, drink water and electrolytes to replace sodium losses and maintain performance. If you're training in hot conditions, increase both water and sodium intake to prevent dehydration and maintain electrolyte balance. Forget that old 8 glasses of water per day rule. Hydration needs vary dramatically between individuals. An easy and effective way to gauge hydration status both coming in and out of your sessions is to look at your urine color. Pale yellow, you're hydrated. Dark yellow or amber, you probably need to drink more. Completely clear, you might want to ease up. You could be overhydrated. If you want precision surrounding your workouts, weigh yourself before and after your workout. If you've lost more than 2% of your body weight, you need to increase fluid intake. If you weigh more post-exercise than pre-exercise, you're probably drinking too much, which could put you at risk for hyponatremia. But let's talk a little bit more about that electrolyte piece. Sodium is the primary electrolyte in sweat, but it's not the only one you need to replace. Magnesium and potassium also play key roles in muscle function, hydration, and preventing cramps, yet they are often overlooked in hydration strategies. Potassium works alongside sodium to maintain fluid balance and nerve function. It also helps prevent muscle cramps and supports heart rhythm stability. You'll want to replenish your potassium using things like bananas, oranges, potatoes, or sports drinks. Magnesium is critical for muscle contraction and relaxation, preventing exercise-induced cramps and fatigue. It plays a critical role in ATP production as well, meaning that it helps your body to generate energy efficiently. Magnesium losses can contribute to increased muscle fatigue, cramping, and even dizziness during prolonged exercise. Magnesium-rich foods include nuts, seeds, leafy greens, and whole grains, but endurance athletes may need additional supplementation or magnesium-enriched electrolyte drinks for heavy sweating. The amount of electrolytes you need during exercise depends on how much you sweat and how salty your sweat is. Some athletes lose more sodium than others, which is why some people cramp more easily than others in long races. A good baseline is 300 300 to 600 milligrams of sodium per hour for most endurance athletes, 700 to 1,000 milligrams per hour for heavy sweaters or those racing in hot, humid conditions. And then for potassium intake, that should be around 100 to 200 milligrams per hour. And then magnesium needs are a little bit lower, but still important at around 50 to 100 milligrams per hour. Sports drinks, electrolyte powders, and even salty snacks can help you to maintain fluid balance, prevent muscle cramps, and keep your performance from crashing late in your activities. The key takeaway here is that hydration is about balance. Too little and your performance takes a nosedive. Too much and you're flushing the sodium your body needs to function. And while sodium gets most of the attention, potassium and magnesium are just as important for sustained endurance and muscle function. Drink strategically, match intake to sweat loss, and never ignore what your body is telling you. Now, I would be remiss if I didn't mention supplements in a discussion about nutrition. And this is a very complex subject that I've covered in depth in videos that I have linked down below and at the end screen. So I'm not going to relitigate all of that here. What I will say is this: supplements should serve a purpose. If you have deficiencies, you might consider supplementation to correct them. If you're outpacing your body's ability to supply what it needs, supplementation could help to bridge the gap. And yes, it's fine to look for a small performance boost. Just don't go overboard. Supplements like creatine, caffeine, or the electrolytes we just talked about can be leveraged effectively before, during, or after your workouts. But start stacking pills and potions like a mad scientist, and at best you've got some expensive pee, and at worst you're moaning and wailing in the nearest ditch mid-session while questioning your life choices. And with that, we've covered what to eat, when to eat, and how to hydrate. It's through this lens that so many athletes are sabotaging themselves. If you're constantly crashing mid-workout, struggling to recover, or watching your training plateau, chances are that you're making mistakes in one or several of these areas. Fix those mistakes and your performance will skyrocket. Now, I can end this video here and let you figure out the rest, but I know how the internet works. If I don't answer some of your burning questions, I'll have a small riot in the comments. So let's take a look at what you guys wanted to know. So I've got my trusty list of questions here, and the first question I have was surrounding some strategies for those with elevated blood sugar or diabetes, and also how to protect your teeth from those sports drinks and gels. Now, I'm not a medical expert. If you have clinical concerns, I really would recommend that you work with a dietitian. But in general, if you're trying to manage your blood sugar, you need to really focus on those low glycemic carbs before workouts. Things like oatmeal, whole grains, or fiber-rich fruits. That'll help you to avoid those spikes and crashes. And then during your longer sessions, you still need to fuel, but maybe you can use diluted sports drinks, whole foods like bananas, or lower sugar endurance fuels. They can really help to keep your glucose more stable without excessive sugar intake. For oral hygiene, yeah, gels and sports drinks are really brutal on your teeth. Since stopping mid-session to brush your teeth isn't really going to happen for you, you might try to stick to larger spaced-out carb intakes rather than that constant sipping, but it really does need to fit in your intensity. You could try less acidic drinks and drink plain water where possible. It's definitely easier as a cyclist with those extra bottle cages, and then you just need to brush your teeth as soon as possible post-session, because let's face it, that 4-hour ride fueled on sugar and dried out saliva is a bacterial paradise. But next question we have here are, what are the best vegetarian options for endurance athletes? And the short answer is that vegetarian endurance athletes really don't need to fuel any differently. It's all about hitting your macros and supporting training demands. Carbs, super easy. Fruits, oats, rice, pasta, potatoes, sports drinks, gels, all of those are vegetarian. Protein, you can talk tofu, tempeh, lentils, beans, quinoa, Greek yogurt, plant-based protein powders. As a vegan, I personally try to mix those complementary proteins like beans and rice, but hitting your total protein intake matters far more than stressing yourself over every amino acid. In terms of fats, things like nuts, seeds, avocados, olive oil, same as anyone else. Bottom line is that you can thrive in endurance sports without animal products. Just get creative. But if you're looking for something a little more specific, let me know in a follow-up in the comments below. The next question we have here is kind of similar to that first question in that they're asking, does a high-carb diet increase the risk of diabetes? That's a really good question. For endurance athletes, burning through high volumes of carbs during training and racing is not in any way the same as excessive sugar intake in a sedentary lifestyle. The key is really going to be context and energy balance. If you're burning what you consume, the risk of diabetes is generally pretty low. But interestingly enough, Lionel Sanders recently released a video talking about his own high blood sugar after years of a pretty trash diet under the assumption that he could process through all those carbs as a high volume and high performance athlete. I think where Lionel got this wrong is that while his body was using the calories, he made assumptions that he needed a nearly endless amount of carbs, forcing them in, and his intake around training far exceeded the quantity his body truly needed to fuel the intensity of the work, and he ultimately ended up with a surplus in the bloodstream. I'm also inclined to believe that there might be a genetic component there as well. But if you do have a family history of diabetes or concerns about insulin sensitivity, it's pretty smart to balance those fast and slow digesting carbs instead of relying only on those gels and sugar-heavy drinks. You can use whole food sources like fruits, oats, and rice that can help to regulate the blood sugar better than ultra-processed endurance fuels. I think for most athletes, though, if you eat a well-balanced diet, even one that is very carb-forward and intelligently plan your fueling for training, there's really not much to be concerned about. But if you do want to be sure, a glucose tolerance test or a session with a sports dietitian can really help to tailor your fueling strategy. All right, the next question we have here is about how the pros get so much in without it being obvious. They ask if variety is key. They ask a little bit about savory foods and what about high-fat foods. Also asking a little bit about sugar water. So pro cyclists fuel constantly. They make it look effortless because they train their gut to handle large carb loads, sometimes up to that 120 grams per hour. The key is going to be frequent, smaller intakes spread out throughout the ride, rather than cramming it in all at once. They likely aren't doing this while the cameras are right in their face, but rest assured there's a perpetual stream of high-performance fuels going in all day, every day. Variety absolutely helps, especially for those long rides. If you struggle to eat enough, you want to mix sports drinks, gels, solid foods, and real food options to keep it palatable. You can use savory options like cheese wraps, rice cakes, or salted nuts. They can be nice breaks from the sweet stuff, but just make sure that they're not super heavy. In terms of the question about sugar water, it does work. Glucose and fructose in the right ratio does fuel endurance pretty well, but it does lack electrolytes and a little bit of that variety, so you might want a more balanced carb mix. And then in terms of fat, a small amount is fine, but too much definitely will slow down your digestion and delay carb absorption. It's really not ideal when the intensity ramps up. So in terms of like a Snickers, if you're going to eat it early in a long ride, it's probably fine, but later when you need that fast fuel, it might sit like a rock in your stomach. All right, next question we have here, super common question. How can I lose weight without losing power? Every time I cut weight, I lose my strength and endurance takes a hit. And this is one of the hardest things to get right. Dropping weight without sacrificing performance. The key is slow, controlled weight loss while fueling strategically. You can't crash diet here. If you're expecting to lose more than a pound or two a week and maintain your power, allow me to bluntly and declaratively tell you it's never going to happen. If you have a shot at doing this, you need to avoid calorie deficits that are huge. 200 to 300 fewer calories per day is more than enough. You want to keep your carbs high around the workouts themselves to fuel performance and recovery, and then you focus on protein and whole foods outside of training to preserve your muscle mass and generate satiety. But you really want to monitor your power to weight ratio improvements rather than just the scale and just raw watts. You may need to sacrifice a few watts on the top end, but if you gain it back in efficiency, you're going to be in better shape. But if that ratio starts to drop, you're definitely cutting too aggressively. And most importantly, you just gotta be patient. Pros do not drop weight overnight, and neither should you. Next question I had on here was the impact of low caloric density foods on performance. And I wasn't entirely sure what this question was asking, but I'll try to take a stab at it here. Low calorie dense foods, leafy greens, raw veggies, high fiber fruits, they're all great for health and satiety, but endurance athletes really need energy dense foods to sustain their training. If you fill up on high bulk, low calorie foods, you might struggle to get in enough energy for your workouts, leading to fatigue, poor recovery, and loss of power. And that kind of relates to the question about weight loss. Low calorie dense foods should complement and not replace your performance foods. If you struggle to get the right amount of energy while prioritizing those healthier options, you might want to try swapping out those higher fiber foods for like cooked, denser options like roasted veggies, nut butters, rice. Those can definitely help. All right, last question I've got on the list here is what is the best fueling strategy for a double century? So 200 miles, and they said over 12 hours. And I kind of covered most of this with the carb intake for endurance events. So using that same principle of 60 to 90 grams of carbs per hour, balanced with electrolytes and hydration. But for those ultra endurance rides, that variety and gut comfort become a lot more important. Relying on things like gels and drink mixes for a full 12 hours, that's a recipe for flavor fatigue and gut distress. So you want to mix in more real food here, like rice cakes, nut butter sandwiches, bananas, salty snacks. Those can help to keep fueling sustainable while still hitting your carb targets. And in this case, you don't want to forget your fat and protein. Carbs should be the primary focus, but the small amounts of fat and protein early in the ride can help to prevent those energy crashes later. And it's going to be a lot easier for you to get that nutrition in while you still have energy early in the ride. It's really going to be critical to test your fueling plan in training over those longest rides that you have leading up to your event. You really want to ensure that your gut can handle the types of food that you want to bring on board. You have to keep to a strict energy plan and resist the feeling that you are too tired to eat. Failing to plan is planning to fail here because you cannot trust your fatigued brain to make those decisions day of. You need to be diligent about having those options handy, take plenty of breaks, and you'll be one of the very few to complete such an accomplishment. But I got a lot of great questions on this one, and while I covered a lot more of them in the main video, if you have more questions, feel free to drop them in the comments below. I'll do my best to answer them there. And while you're down there, you can show those like and subscribe buttons some love. It really helps the channel more than you know. Thank you all so much for watching, and as always, I'll catch you in the next one. See ya.